we're going to do a process calibration on one of our sensors. In this particular case, we're going to do a connectivity process calibration. Be the same idea as connectivity, pH, or RRP. Before we ever do a calibration, if we're going to do a process calibration, we really want to make sure that our handheld or whatever unit we're going to use to calibrate our unit for the process calibration is calibrated already. So in another segment, we'll calibrate a Myron, and we'll calibrate another probe or another handheld. So in this case, we've already calibrated it. We already have that in mind. We're going to go ahead and go through the steps that we should do for the calibration. Now, whenever we're doing a calibration, any type of calibration, before you calibrate the unit or the actual probe, you want to make sure that the probe has been cleaned. So you don't want to calibrate anything unless you know that the probe's clean. So if I were to go in and clean this, if I were to go in and calibrate this unit and the probe's dirty, it would throw my reading off, right? So we're going to go in, we're going to isolate the probe right now. We're going to go ahead and shut off the water. Now you still have a little bit of pressure in here, so you want to make sure you release the pressure on the unit so you don't damage the probe and you don't damage anything on the unit itself. So once we've done that, we're going to go in. We're going to make sure that we have taken all the pressure off the unit. In this case, we're going to do the connectivity, but we're going to show you also a probe on the pH so you can see it. So this probe here, we're going to make sure that this part is clean here. And there's a couple ways you can do it depending on how dirty it is, but kind of just rinse it off with a light cloth. You can just clean the probe. Make sure it's not dirty, clean around it. And you can put that back into service. Now, one thing that you noticed possibly, and it was a good thing, is that this O-ring fell out. What's really important is that you need to make sure that the O-ring's inside the unit onto the housing. Many times we'll lose those and we'll put them back in and we'll forget that it's on there. We keep wrenching it down tight and it keeps leaking. You don't need to put any duct tape on it or any tape or Teflon or anything like that. Just make sure the O-ring's in there. On the connectivity probe, on the wall cam probes, most of them have a little line up on them, on the probe itself. We've seen it's clean, we know it's clean, we've rinsed it off, we've wiped it off, and put it back in. Line up the actual fitting there and screw it back in. Now we know that connectivity probe's clean, so now we could go through and do our calibration. I'm going to show you something really quick too on the pH probe. pH probe's a little different, as well as the ORP. Once again, make sure our O-ring's in there. You notice it has a glass on it. Same thing, rinse it off. Real light wipe. Clean off the probe. Very important is that the glass on here is very thin. So you don't want to use anything harsh to rub on it. So if you notice that there's something on there that you can't get off of there, you need to determine what it is. You know, if it's calcium carbonate, then you need to possibly do a 5% hydrochloric acid solution, and then you can get that off there. You don't ever want to scrape on that or scratch this lens. If you do, you're going to damage the lens. Also, you don't want to use any harsh detergents that will take the thin layer off of that lens. Once you've done that, you've damaged the lens and it's not going to read properly. So now we have flow back on our unit. We're getting ready to do our process calibration. You want to let it run for probably a minute or so just to get all the bubbles out of the line. Sometimes what will happen is if you do leave the air in there, it will throw off the reading of the probe. Want to make sure that we have good flow across the probe itself. Okay. So then what we'll do is we'll go in and we'll do a grab sample on our probe. Rinse it out twice, 3 times. We'll take our reading. Then we'll go into Then we'll go into our actual, there's two ways you can do this. But the most common way is we'll go into our inputs, because it's an actual probe. We'll go into our conductivity probe, contacting conductivity in this case. If it was a pH or if it was ORP, you would do that as well. We're going to hit conductivity. Now you have these different icons here at the bottom. The icon you're looking for is the calibration icon. You'll hit that, and you're going to see that you have different options in calibrating. So the option that we're going to look at is the 1-point process calibration. That means that you're still running, your probe's in line. It's reading what the actual process is reading. You have a 1-point buffer calibration, or you might have a 2-point buffer calibration for a pH or ORP probe. Those are if you actually have buffers and you pull them out and you'll put them inside of the buffers and do your calibration. Now with the contacting conductivity probe, you have an open air calibration. And what that is basically reading is you're going to be reading air, which should be a 0 conductivity if there's no contaminants in the air. So you'll be reading a 0 calibration on that. You would actually pull the probe out, clean it, hold it to air, and it'll say 0. Or if it's off, then you would hit the calibration and put 0 in. In this point, in this process, we're going to do the 1-point process. So we'll hit the 1-point process. This is what the actual default reading is, 6390. This is what the reading for the probe that we have in there now that it's reading. And in our case, off of our handheld, our reading is 5660. So we're just going to go in real simple, 5660, and hit our calibration, our new reading. Hit that. It'll let us know that it did the changes on the gain and it did the changes on the probe. It's asking us if we want to save the results. We do. And then that's our new reading. Pretty simple. You can exit back out and you should see your reading right there. Now, if our reading didn't take in our calibration and for some reason we put our calibration in and it was off and it wouldn't save the calibration, it could be a couple things. Maybe your probe's still dirty, maybe your probe is not connected properly, so I would check the wiring connections, or possibly your probe is just no good anymore. In the conductivity probe, there is other troubleshooting we could do across it to check it on your pH or ORP. After about a year, usually your probes start to fault. So we would probably go ahead and change those probes out, the actual electrode part of it. So that's pretty much it. Now I've always been asked, how often should we calibrate our probes? It's always going to vary. Some processes are very clean and you really won't have to calibrate them more than maybe once a week, even once a month. I would recommend that you do calibrations at least once a month, at least a process calibration. If possible, at least you could use a buffer to do your calibrations at least once a month would be ideal, but at least do a process calibration. Sometimes you will go a week, you can go a day, you might go 2 weeks. Depends really on how the process is, how dirty it is, how much operation is going through, there are changes in it. So the fluctuation also of your water can determine how often you have to do the calibration.